In the shadow of Mount Shasta, beneath the dense canopy of the Trinity Alps, there are whispers, stories carried on the wind, buried in yellowed newspapers and passed from one trembling voice to the next. These are not just campfire tales. These are eyewitness accounts from hunters, hikers, loggers, and ordinary people who claim they came face to face with something massive and unknown. Tonight, we take you deep into Bigfoot country, where the wilderness keeps its secrets and sometimes something watches back. Bigfoot sighting on Mount Shasta recounted after 5 years by Emily Frank Hans, special correspondent. Has Bigfoot ever roamed the towering flanks of Mount Shasta? According to logger Virgil Larson, the answer is a firm and resounding yes. Larson, a burly, no-nonsense woodsman who worked for Columbia Helicopter Company in the autumn of 1976, recently came forward to recount his strange encounter. He was operating on the forested lower slopes, just south of Cascade Gulch, when he spotted what he initially assumed was a man. But as the figure approached, he realized it was something else entirely. Chilling encounter on Canyon Creek Trail leaves hikers shaken, by Dennis Murphy, staff reporter. A quiet autumn camping trip took a frightening turn for 2 hikers along the Canyon Creek Trail in Trinity County last weekend. Alan and Denise Whitaker, a married couple from Redding, were backpacking into the wilderness when they had what they describe as a close-range encounter with something not quite human and not quite animal. The Whitakers had set up camp along a secluded bend of the creek late Friday afternoon. By nightfall, the forest had gone unnervingly silent. The creature didn't charge or vocalize, it simply watched. After nearly a full minute, it turned and slipped away into the darkness, moving so quietly that Alan doubted what he'd seen, until they found the footprints. Lone hunter claims eerie encounter with ghost ape near Panther Meadows by Marjorie Stanton, features editor. Carl Benson, a seasoned hunter with more than 2 decades of experience in the Shasta Trinity wilderness, never thought he'd become part of a local legend, but on a misty morning in early August, while scouting game trails near Panther Meadows, he came face to face with something he says science has yet to name. Carl Benson. I was moving slow, watching the tree line. I kept hearing something behind me, soft steps like someone pacing me. I'd stop, it'd stop. I moved, it moved, always just out of sight. Benson initially dismissed it as a deer until the stench hit him. Carl Benson, it was awful, like wet fur and rotten meat. Moments later, he caught a glimpse, a hulking, dark figure ducking behind a cluster of manzanita, its eyes gleaming faintly in the early light. Carl Benson, I only saw it for a second, but the height, the mass. It wasn't a bear. Its shoulders were like 2 barrels stacked together. It was shaped like a man, but heavier, like it was built for power. He tried to track it, but the creature stayed just out of reach. At one point, Benson found a section of crushed grass and a twisted pine sapling. The tree had been wrenched at an angle well beyond the strength of a man. Back in town, Benson reported the incident to forest officials and was met with polite skepticism, but local tribal elders weren't surprised. Mary Tanaya, the old ones, called it semi-cho, the forest watcher. It does not harm without reason, but it remembers those who trespass. Highway patrolman. Shaken after late-night sighting near McLeod by James Walters' Law and Order beat, California Highway Patrol Officer Dan Rule isn't one to scare easily, but his patrol run on the night of October 30th left him visibly disturbed and questioning everything he thought he knew about the wilderness. Dan Rule up. I was responding to a call about a disabled vehicle along Highway 89, just a few miles south of McLeod. It was just after midnight. Fog was heavy and visibility was low. I pulled up behind the car and then I saw it. Something crossed the road right in front of me. Rule described the figure as tall, bipedal, and covered in shaggy hair that glistened in his high beams. Dan Rule, it wasn't running, just gliding, like it wasn't in a hurry, like it didn't care I was there. I hit the spotlight and saw the face. Dark skin, deep-set eyes. It looked back at me. The officer stepped out, weapon drawn, but the creature had vanished into the dense pines. No prints were found due to the rocky shoulder, but tire tracks from the stranded vehicle showed erratic swerves as if the driver had panicked and fled. Later that week, a retired road worker came forward, recalling similar sightings along the same stretch of highway in the 1960s. Retired road worker. We used to joke about the highway shadow, but it wasn't a joke to the men who quit over it. Students flee campsite after midnight terror near Swift Creek by Lorna Hawthorne, field reporter. What was supposed to be a peaceful weekend retreat in the Trinity Alps turned into a night of terror for 3 Chico State students after a bizarre encounter near Swift Creek campground. Matt Diaz, Carla Moreno and Brian Shaw had pitched a tent along the creek's edge. The evening passed uneventfully until midnight, when the forest seemed to come alive with something unseen. Carla Moreno, "We heard something circling us, not running, just slow, deliberate steps in the brush. Then something pushed against the tent wall. Matt grabbed his flashlight and slashed it across the clearing." Matt Diaz, it was maybe 10 feet away, crouched down, staring at us. Its arms were huge, down past its knees, and its chest, it wasn't hairy like the rest of it. It was leathery like elephant skin. The creature rose slowly, never breaking eye contact. Brian Shaw, its teeth were weird, longer than a human's. The canines kind of stuck out. It sniffed the air like it was testing us. Paralyzed with fear, the students remained still until the figure backed away into the darkness. They packed their gear in near silence and fled the site before dawn. When they returned days later with a ranger, they found enormous footprints near the fire ring, some sunken nearly 2 inches into the soil. Forest officials would not comment on the find, but a nearby camper claimed to have heard screaming baboon-like cries that same night. Early morning fisherman spots mountain shadow at Lake Siskiyou by Leo Hart, outdoors columnist. An early morning fishing trip at Lake Siskiyou turned unsettling for Roy Taggart, a retired railroad engineer who claims he came face to face with a creature most say doesn't exist. Roy Taggart, "I'd just cast out into the inlet and was having my coffee when I saw movement down by the water. It looked like a bear crouching, scooping water, but then it stood up, and I nearly dropped my thermos." What Taggart saw was a towering humanoid figure, nearly 9 feet tall, with thick hair dripping from its arms and chest. Roy Taggart. Its arms hung long, the hands big enough to crush a melon, but the eyes, those were no animal eyes. They were curious, aware. As the creature noticed him, it let out a low huffing sound and stepped back into the trees. Taggart watched it vanish, noting how its massive form barely rustled the brush. He returned later with his nephew, and the two discovered enormous footprints along the muddy shoreline. Roy Taggart's nephew, 15 inches at least, and spaced like it had a 5-foot stride. Locals have taken to calling the creature the Mountain Shadow, a name used by fishermen for decades when speaking of unexplained disturbances around the lake. Late-night howls and shaking trees, Bigfoot rumors rise near Bluff Creek, by Janine Kelso, Regional Affairs Correspondent. In the thick of the Mount Shasta foothills just west of Bluff Creek, a pair of forestry contractors report a night of unexplained terror, and the clearest sounds yet suggesting something large and vocal may dwell in those woods. Jake Hollister and Ray Moody, both employed by a reforestation outfit from Medford, had set up camp near the logging road to begin seedling replacement in the area. Hollister described the first night as uneventful, though eerily quiet. Jake Hollister, no wind, no bugs, no night birds. Like the forest was holding its breath, but the second night changed everything. Just after midnight, the men were awakened by a series of low, whooping calls echoing from the ridgeline. Ray Moody. It was like a gorilla crossed with a siren, deep, long, and answered by another one farther down the canyon. Then the trees started to shake. Neither man could see anything at first, but as the calls grew louder, their tent began to shudder from something pressing against the guy lines. Hollister grabbed a flashlight and shone it through the mesh and saw a silhouette that made his stomach drop. Jake Hollister. It was huge, at least 9 feet tall, built like a linebacker but shaggy all over. It had one hand braced on a pine tree, not clawing, just resting there. I could see fingers, long ones. The creature didn't run or charge, but simply turned and walked away, brushing through the manzanita as if it were knee-high grass. The next morning, the men found broken limbs 6 feet off the ground and large tracks embedded in soft moss. Each was about 16 inches long, with a wide, flattened toe spread, almost like a barefoot giant. The Forest Service declined to comment on the incident, but a local resident, 73-year-old Winona Cray of Carrick, said she's heard the same howls in that valley for years. Winona Cray, that's no bear, that's the tall one. Lives between the creeks, only comes out when it's real cold. Terrifying trail encounter shakes solo hiker on Russian wilderness loop by Walter Grimley, special contributor. What began as a peaceful solo backpacking trip into the Russian wilderness turned into a disturbing brush with the unknown for Robert Phelan, a retired schoolteacher from Ashland, Oregon. Phelan, 51, had planned a 5-day loop through the Marble Mountains, starting from the Lovers Camp trailhead. An experienced outdoorsman, he had hiked the trail dozens of times. But on the third night, camping near Big Elk Lake, he was awakened by a deep, rattling growl. Robert Phelan. At first I thought it was a cougar, but then I realized it wasn't coming from one place, it was circling me. Phelan stayed inside his tent, flashlight in hand, until dawn. In the early morning light, he found the soil around his camp churned up with massive footprints, like a barefoot basketball player had done laps around my tent. The next day he tried to make it to the next ridge, but the woods were unusually quiet, until just before dusk. Robert Phelan. I stopped to rest. That's when I heard it. Branches cracking, slow breathing, not a snort or sniff like a bear, actual breathing. And then I saw it. He described a figure nearly 10 feet tall, partially obscured by a deadfall tree. Robert Phelan. Its hair was reddish-brown, almost auburn in the sun. Its face was flat and human-like, but broader. It was holding onto a branch like a person would, watching me. I didn't feel like prey. I felt like I was being evaluated. Phelan backed away slowly, never turning his back. The creature watched, but didn't follow. Though his trip was cut short, he managed to photograph several partial prints in the trail dust. The photos, now submitted to a Sasquatch research group in Eugene, have been deemed highly compelling. Robert Phelan. This isn't about belief anymore, it's about respect. There's something ancient out there, something we don't understand. And it's watching us as much as we're watching it. Rail worker sees man-beast along Scree Slope above Mossbrae Falls by Harold Fisher, senior staff writer. For over 30 years, Kenneth Avery walked the rails between Dunsmuir and Shasta Springs as part of his track inspection route. But nothing in his long career prepared him for what he saw just after dawn on a quiet morning in July. Avery had stopped his motorized rail cart near the falls to inspect a minor rock slide. As he rounded the bend on foot, he heard what he thought was someone grunting in pain. Then came a sound he describes as a heavy exhale, like a steam engine clearing its throat. Kenneth Avery. I looked up the Scree Slope just above the falls, and there it was. A massive figure crouched low, picking at something in the rocks. It wasn't a bear. It was shaped like a man, but bulkier, like a wrestler wearing a fur coat. The figure noticed him seconds later and rose slowly to its full height. Avery estimated it to be at least 8.5 feet tall. Kenneth Avery. Its arms hung lower than any man's. The head was small in proportion to the body. The eyes caught the morning sun, not red, not glowing, just watching. The creature backed away, turned, and with staggering agility climbed up the slope and disappeared into the thick underbrush. Avery radioed the rail yard, initially claiming he saw a bear, Kenneth Avery. But I knew that wasn't true. I just didn't want to explain it over the radio. Later inspection of the slope revealed long impressions in the rock dust, more like human footprints than paw prints, each over 15 inches long. A torn piece of moss-covered bark was also found, freshly stripped and smeared with an oily residue. Locals familiar with the area note that Mossbrae Falls has long been tied to strange stories, eerie lights, disappearing hikers, and sightings of upright creatures bathing in the secluded pools. Kenneth Avery, I don't scare easy, but I won't go up that trail again, not alone, not after what I saw. Snowbound rancher reports frightening visit in Scott Valley by Deborah Lane, special field correspondent. The early snow came hard to Scott Valley in 1980, and for local rancher Merle Jensen, it brought something else. Something he'd hoped was only legend. Jensen lives just outside Callahan, on a remote parcel near the Marble Mountains. On the night of November 29, as the storm howled and temperatures dropped into the teens, he was tending to a generator when he heard what he described as a scream that didn't belong to anything God made. Merle Jensen. I've heard mountain lions, but this was different. Deeper, angrier, like a human yell, but from a throat too big. He rushed back to his cabin and locked the door. A half-hour later, his dog, a seasoned cattle herder, began whining and clawing to be let inside. That's when Jensen heard it, heavy footsteps, crunching through the snow, slow and deliberate. Merle Jensen. I turned out the lights and looked through the window. Something was moving through the pines just outside the lantern glow. It walked upright, broad as a freezer chest and just as tall. The figure circled the cabin once, pausing at the barn where Jensen had stored sacks of feed. The next morning, he found one of the barn doors partially open, claw marks on the wood, and the feed sacks torn into as if by enormous hands. But the most disturbing evidence was left in the snow. Merle Jensen footprints, not bare, toes, 5 of them. Each print was almost 18 inches long, with a strange arch like a second heel. He contacted the sheriff, who offered to send a deputy once the road cleared. Merle Jensen. That was 3 days later. By then, the snow had covered everything. Neighbors have whispered for years about strange sightings during heavy winters, when the valleys grow quiet and the forests reclaim the roads. Jensen isn't looking for attention or trouble. Merle Jensen, I just want people to know what's out here. It's not a story, it's not make-believe, and it's still out there waiting for the snow to fall again. If these stories stirred your curiosity, or your fear, don't wander off just yet. Like, subscribe and follow for more encounters pulled from the forgotten edges of the map, because out here, the next story could be yours.